Honored to have a stellar group of panelists today. I know you've all had a chance to read their bios when you registered for the program, but I will ask them to briefly introduce themselves before I ask them to respond to my first question. And then later in the session, I will, of course, field questions from you all, the listeners. And so please put those in the Q&A now if you have them. I want to emphasize right off the bat that the panelists are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations in which they're employed or are members, unless they make that distinction clear in their remarks. So let's begin. I'd like to start with Dr. Kerry Banks, Jr., who is a department chair, associate professor of engineering, engineering and technology, and the NCAA faculty athletics representative at Norfolk State University. Dr. Banks, welcome, and thank you so much for being a panelist. What would you like our audience to know about you and your work?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be on this cast today. I've been working with Norfolk State University 30 plus years and working in the capacity as a faculty athletic representative for a little over 12 and a half years. So I've had an opportunity to really review our activities and practices. I've seen our growth and our expansion in our athletics program. We were formerly Division II, now Division I institution. So it's really been a tremendous trip for me here at the university as part of the Mideastern Athletic Conference and as a part of a person who served on a variety of committees, from legislation to the Committee on Academics and so forth. And last thing I say about myself, I'm so happy that the FARA organization installed me as the inaugural Division I FAR of the Year in 2019. So to be selected by my peers for such a level of award and recognition was truly an honor. So I look forward to this conversation. I think there's some things that we can add to this that will encourage everyone to follow Division I sports even more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banks, and congratulations on that award. What an honor. Next, I'd like to go to Oliver Luck, who is chairman of Altius Sports Partners, former NCAA Executive Vice President for Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Partnerships, and former athletic director at West Virginia University. Mr. Luck, thank you so much for being here. Please introduce yourself and share a few thoughts about why you're here on this panel.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It's an honor to be with all the other panelists. I'm on this panel because I think really two reasons. One, I absolutely love college sports. I'm an institutionalist, and I think institutions are very important in this country. And intercollegiate athletics, going back, to what the Rutgers-Princeton game in 1860 something, for just decades, college sports has been very important to a lot of people, and I want to see that continue, even though obviously all of this is being changed very quickly as we move into I think a very promising future for sports. But I'm also the second reason I guess I'm on this panel. I've been involved with both professional sports and college sports, as you mentioned, AD at my alma mater, West Virginia University. Worked for the NFL for a number of years. Worked for Major League Soccer. So I've been on sort of the for-profit sports side as well as the not-for-profit sports side, if you will. And I'm honored to be with this very esteemed group.
Thank you so much, Mr. Luck. And we also have Eric Prisbell, the National College Sports Business Writer for On3.com, who has previously covered virtually every angle of college sports for the Washington Post and USA Today. Eric, welcome. Please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure. Oh, thanks so much for having me, Aaron. It's really great to be here. And, like I said, I've covered, college sports for more than 2 decades now. Spent a lot of time at the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Fresno Bee in California as my first job covering Jerry Tarkanian. So I go back so long that not only was the print product of newspapers popular back then, but, I used to do stories on basketball players getting free meals or under the table money, and that would cause an institutional investigation. And now to see how far we've come and to cover college sports in the middle of this Category 5 storm of reform, it's really special to me. And at On3 Sports, I cover the sports business world of college, of the collegiate landscape across the board, and NIL as well. And there's change afoot across the board. So it's really special to be covering this college sports landscape at this time.
Thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate you being here. And last but not least, we have Maddie Solomon, a college athlete advocate, a former Duke University scholarship lacrosse player, a former chair of the NCAA Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee, and host of the Speaking of Athletes podcast. Ms. Solomon, thank you so much for being here and welcome. What would you like our audience to know about you and your work?
Thanks for having me. I think I'm extremely passionate about helping athletes and their parents, especially navigate kind of some of the complexities of college sports. And I think that the experience that I had chairing the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee, it gave me a perspective and a lens that I felt like I needed to share in my continued advocacy of athletes. When I got done being chair of SAC, I realized that many of the problems that I experienced as an athlete, that many of my friends experienced as athletes, that so many of the athletes that I advocated for were still going on, and nobody was talking about it at the time. And so I felt like I had an obligation to start speaking out and sharing that perspective and really starting to educate the public, because what I did notice, being on the inside of so many rooms within the NCAA where legislation was created, was that change pretty much happened from the outside. There was usually a response to outside pressures. The problem was that most people didn't know what went on within the walls of the NCAA. And I think more has come out and there's been a tremendous shift. But my continued advocacy has also involved me serving as vice president of the College Football Players Association, testifying before one of the many hearings before Congress on NIL. And my focus is really on player health and well-being. I'm, passionate about making sure that athletes are not taken advantage of in the NIL era, but there are so many problems that pre-existed NIL that really need to be corrected, and that I'm hopeful, we can continue to move in the right direction on that.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate all of you being here and introducing yourselves. And that's a really good segue to my first question, which is for everybody. And so I'd like to start with Dr. Banks first, if that's all right. But this question is really about the topic of the panel, Baker's proposal, I should say, and what you're hearing about this proposal from the people that you're talking to, the stakeholders at your university. I know you just recently came back from the NCAA convention. Perhaps you want to speak about that, but really an open-ended question about your thoughts on Baker's proposal.
I've had an opportunity to speak to a number of people, formal as well as informal, regarding his notion. As a matter of fact, when I was at the FARA conference in Indianapolis, President Baker also provided some context for his interest. And I'll be honest, I've worked with the organization for a number of years, and I think this is the right time to place on the table grand ideas, or at least grand potential proposals that people can really look at, pick through, and say, are we developing at a rate and at a pace that the sport is? Sometimes, thought leaders don't have the exact answer, but they know the direction they want to go towards. So that kind of thinking is quite impressive in some respects, because it allows people to bring to the table their interests, their backgrounds, and the things that they think are important. I've served on committees at times when there were no student athletes on the committee. And so you didn't get that feeling of having inclusivity from the very persons who are going to be the recipients of these rules. So I applaud it. I think it definitely has to be vetted. The interest of everyone involved, the student athlete, the administrator, the coach, the fans, have to be engaged and should offer insight, because it matters. The ability for our students to be treated properly and fairly on the field, as well as in the area of the classroom. And as a teacher, I'm constantly advocating for my students academically, because the venue in which I serve, our students, they go professional in something other than sports every semester and every year. And so it matters to me that my students who get professional opportunities. It's not just sports, but includes the academic preparation they receive in the classroom. And that matters to me.
Thank you so much. Mr. Luck, would you like to continue with this question about Baker's proposal? What are you hearing from the stakeholders that you're talking to?
So it's very interesting. You know, this proposal from Charlie Baker caught a lot of folks off guard, quite honestly, and it probably shouldn't have. I think it's pretty clear that when Charlie took the position, he sort of applied his political acumen, which is really unquestioned given his background as governor, Republican governor of a Democrat state. That's for 2 terms getting stuff done. But Charlie spent a lot of time early in his tenure on a listening tour, and he was very clear that he wanted to, hear as much as he possibly could. It seems as though his proposal represents a lot of that feedback. In other words, he clearly heard from the, Power 4 or whatever you want to call it, the top 50, 60 schools, that they felt like they could do a lot more for their student athletes if they were allowed to. Hence, part of the proposal is based on those schools that can afford it doing a lot more. I think he also heard from student athletes that they like, generally speaking, NIL. It's a serious transfer of dollars from collectives and alumni and boosters and sponsors to student athletes, and that's obviously a good thing. Yes, there probably are some egregious cases that should be remedied, but he heard a positive response on NIL, and that's a part of his proposal. And then the other thing I think he heard a lot of, and he was criticized somewhat, but was that student athletes don't necessarily want to be employees. There's a big discussion going on whether that makes sense or not, and obviously there's 3 or 4 cases, Johnson case, et cetera, in the courts, including in the administrative level at the NLRB. But I think I get a sense that Charlie heard from a number of athletes, maybe a majority of athletes that he spoke to, who really didn't want to be necessarily employees. Everybody on this Zoom, those of us participating, those that listening, we've all been employees, and we all know the pluses and the minuses of the employment relationship. So I think Charlie, as a leader, should, and I think he did an excellent job, as Carrie mentioned, of broaching this topic and putting something on the table. But I think he synthesized all of that information that he received from commissioners, from coaches, from presidents, from student athletes. And I applaud him for this. It's going to, work its way through the governance system of the NCAA, and it won't come out the same way it goes in. There'll be modification and changes. But I tip of my hat, kudos to Charlie for beginning this very important conversation.
Thank you very much. Eric, would you like to continue? What are you hearing from people in your reporting about the proposal?
Sure. I think Charlie Baker has rightfully been praised almost universally for introducing a bold, innovative, forward-thinking proposal that blindsided a lot of stakeholders. And it also was not on brand for the NCAA, which has been known for decades upon decades for being rigid and inflexible. So that is a great sign and a great first step. Now, to the specific elements in the proposal, they're obviously trying to fast track the moving NIL activity in-house under the school's umbrella. The Division I Board of Directors green-lighted the Division I Council to start working on recommendations regarding the proposal overall, but I think specifically, and I've heard specifically regarding the NIL element, it's more lower hanging fruit, I think, compared with the subdivision element. Look, moving NIL in-house, I've been told for probably 8 months now, it's been long overdue. I mean, it would streamline the operation. It would add more credibility to have the school brand behind it. And it would address donor fatigue, because now donors are pulled in 2 different directions between collectives and also traditional athletic department contributions. So I think that's realistic to get that fast tracked and maybe approved by late this summer. The other aspect, the subdivision, including allowing highly resourced schools to create their own policies and establish a annual trust fund where they could give, and it may be an arbitrary number, $30,000 each to half their athletes. There's a lot of questions that come with that, and that's what I'm being told. There's more pushback regarding that. Specifically, who is equipped financially to get into this subdivision? Texas, Ohio State, those schools? Absolutely. I just read a Washington Post story that said, based on the proposal, it would cost Texas 3.4% of their revenue to be, to take part in that trust fund element. Whereas Rutgers, also in a power conference, it would cost maybe 9 or 10%. So there's going to be a cutoff line, and it'll be interesting to see who's left behind and who's willing and able to take part in that. But it's also, I'm being told, an acknowledgement from the president of the NCAA that schools directly paying athletes for the first time would not kill college sports. So once that's established, where do we go with revenue, true revenue sharing, and athletes getting a slice of the enormous broadcast revenue pies that are out there? And I think that's a much larger question that will be asked and answered in the coming years, because many stakeholders, I feel, believe that revenue sharing is a virtual inevitability at this point.
Thank you so much, Eric. And Maddie, what about you? What are you hearing from parents and from athletes about Baker's proposal?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to say that there are so many different tangents that we could go off on already on everything that everybody said. I think that I would agree that I don't think this is that shocking. I don't think it should have come as a surprise to so many people. So many of these concepts are not new within the NCAA. These have been things that have floated around. Even the idea of a separate subdivision at some point in a different way. Back in 2014, when the Power Fives were granted autonomy over some of the rules, there was discussion about the bigger football schools branching off and starting their own conference then. I think for a very long time, there's been such a discrepancy between the top of Division I and the lower tier schools in Division I that it's not really made sense for a very long time to apply certain rules across the board to all those schools. They have different needs, they have different focuses, they have different resources. Their athletes are interested in different things. I think even when it comes to NIL, there are certain athletes that need a lot of resources that I think there's a tremendous need for education, period. But at certain schools, you have a lot more athletes who are getting offered more deals that are more active in the NIL space compared to some of the schools where maybe there isn't as much of an interest, except for those very proactive athletes. So the focus on providing NIL resources is not as high of a priority for those schools. So that has made a lot of sense. I think, President Baker inherited a very impossible situation, and it would have been interesting to see what might have happened within the NCAA had he taken the helm earlier and had the opportunity to get ahead of some of these things, including Alston. And I think a lot of the concepts are heading in the right direction. I think that there are some issues, particularly with this idea of a standardized NIL contract, for instance. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that that's been something that's been very much pushed by the stakeholders within the NCAA. But practically speaking, goods and services across NIL deals vary so drastically. It doesn't make sense to have one standardized form that you would use for all those deals. I think when you get to the issue of employment status, I think there's so many questions when it comes to that and so many unknowns that until there is more definition there, it very much makes sense that athletes are reluctant. And I think that there has been such a tremendous shift in opportunities, and just even, I think the confidence that athletes have in the NIL era and what they're focusing on. So, I think overall he is moving things in a good direction, a positive one. And I think that it's really setting up a world where you're forcing schools to devote more resources in such a way that they have to make decisions in other arenas. And I think if they are forced in these various ways to devote more funds to athletes, you are going to see, hopefully a shift in college coach salaries and the outrageous spending that really doesn't benefit athletes. And I think overall there has been this mindset shift with NIL, with what President Baker is focusing on. So I think overall a lot of things are going to be shaped, but it is a positive, I think, step for the NCAA at this point.
Aaron, if I could just
Yeah, please do. Go
raise
ahead.
one issue that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's critical. As Charlie Baker went on this listening tour, one of the other things I'm sure he heard, very, very often was keep the NCAA basketball tournament together. That is the sole, almost so only revenue stream that the NCAA has. So, all the old AAA schools, right, the schools that really rely on basketball, they want to keep that tournament together. So, even though it wasn't necessarily alluded to in Charlie's letter from whatever it is now, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, I think the underpinning of it was, this is something that we have to do for the football schools, if you will, the 50, 60, whatever number there's going to be in a new subdivision. But this is being done to keep the NCAA basketball tournament for the men and the women together. As I'm sure Eric knows from his journalism, there's a number of entities out there that would be glad to put together a basketball tournament of the top 50, 60, whatever schools, et cetera, and in a sense, not necessarily bypass the NCAA tournament, but create an alternative. So that's something else that I think, I personally believe we should give Charlie Baker credit for, because obviously the tournament's hugely important to the vast majority of schools that aren't in the, in the Power Four.
The one thing I would like to also add that we didn't talk about is all the disclosure requirements. And I do think that is an area where there's too much emphasis on forcing athletes to disclose way too much information, and really force brands to be in a position where they're revealing the terms of their contracts and their proprietary information. And I think overall, it really kind of serves to allow third parties to collect a lot of data and information that really doesn't protect athletes. It's just a way for them to market their services. So I think that is one of the biggest issues that I take with the direction that he's trying to take things.
So, Maddie, that's a good point. If public institutions moved all their NIL in-house, there would need to be, I think, complete disclosure, because it's a public institution. And no matter where the money is coming from a sponsor, from a donor, from a booster, you would think once it's funneled through a public institution, I would think that there's going to be requirements for disclosure, not to mention FOIA and all the other the other issues regarding transparency.
Yeah, maybe I should distinguish between private and those deals between the schools and the athletes, because I agree with you. And I think the same can be said of collectives, that those contracts between athletes should be more public, because you're talking about funds that are basically being funneled through the schools already in the same fashion. But I think when it comes to those individual deals that aren't run through the schools, there's too much emphasis on basically the athletes having to reveal all of their information.
So let me stop you guys real quick, and let's move to the next question. I want to talk about the fans' perspective. That's a perspective that probably all of you share, but we haven't really dug into it. So I have a question here from a passionate college sports fan who writes, historically, college sports has been grounded in tradition, whether that is banners and traditions of the 50s or regional rivalries. What will evolve in the future model to replace the passion and connectivity of the fan? And as a follow-up, I think we all can see that the definition of student athlete has changed, either by design or as a consequence. The notion of student athlete has effectively been replaced by semi-pro. And is it the job of educational institutions to essentially run semi-pro teams? So I wonder how you would all respond to this fan's perspective. Perhaps Dr. Banks or Eric would like to begin.
Yeah, I'll start just by saying I think we have to evolve with the times. When I was in school some time ago, going to the local college sporting event was the main event to go to in my community. I'm from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and when the Vikings were playing, that was the place to be on the weekend. Or if we were going to Greenville, we'd go down to East Carolina, and we knew the whole city would be just painted, purple and gold, and you'd have a good time. Well, now times have changed. Kids are like, I'm not going to the game. I might stream it. So we have to make sure, and many of the people who are participating in college athletics now, they are streaming because they can do more than one game and one event at a time. And just a follow-up to what Oliver was saying earlier, when President Baker was speaking at our FARA conference, I asked him directly. I says, we want to make sure that, yes, there's integrity with the NIL process and its effect on college sports. I said, but I want us to think and operate also in ensuring that there will be a unit for the women's side of the NCAA tournament. And those are the types of products and byproducts of this process and all the other discussions we have to ensure that we're protecting and undergirding all the resources we provide, because it is important that the experience, and I've had a chance to travel with both our men and our women at postseason play, and the experience oftentimes is quite different on the women's side when you're playing in the gyms versus the men's side when you're playing in the arenas, the swag bag and all the other accommodations. So I think we can walk and chew gum and solve multiple problems, but we have to have multiple points of input.
And Dr. Banks, I want to stay with you real quick and talk about a little bit more about the NCAA convention. You were just there, and a lot has been said about what might happen if Baker's proposal is passed by the NCAA. What are you hearing from people at the NCAA about that prospect? Do you agree with Eric that it might be able to be fast-tracked this summer?
So very quick, with part of my background in construction, one of the things I teach in class every day, that we are problem solvers. So regardless of what's happening that day, that building must be constructed, that bridge must be completed, and regardless of which side of the embankment you start on, that bridge has to meet in the middle. So when I was at one of the meetings, in fact, it was the meeting hosted by the Knight Foundation, one of the commentors after the event said in a small group construction, man, this is going to be tough. I don't know how we're going to do this or execute this proposal that Dr. Baker's supporting. I said, it's easy. And they all looked at me like I was strange because, I'm from, as we categorize, a limited resource institution. I said, it's very simple. I said, all of the institutions that are involved in this process are already funding at this amount graduate assistants. And they have more graduate assistants than this proposal is even proposing you support at your institution with the student athletes program. So we apply some of the same principles. There are students who are working and providing services on behalf of the institution, and they are being accommodated by tuition and fees as well as a stipend. We do the same way with student athletes, and it's even a smaller number as this is purported. So I think we just have to think outside of the box and say, this is the situation, let's solve it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bates. I don't want to go to Eric because this does lead into a question that we discussed earlier when we talked, Eric, about, what are you hearing in your reporting about the level of concern for this employee model where the universities might hire these athletes? Are people pretty concerned about that as a potentiality?
I think there's universal concern, Aaron, regarding the employment question. That's the overarching issue hovering over all of the smaller debates regarding NIL, everything else. And there was a good amount of time spent on the employee debate in today's congressional hearing, which is titled and supposed to be on NIL, but you can't avoid getting into the employee debate. Right now we have two National Labor Relations Board cases progressing, one involving USC, the Pac-12, and the NCAA, and the other one specifically involving Dartmouth's men's basketball team. There's also a court case proceeding, the Johnson case, that relates to overtime pay, but does have an employee element to it as well. So you have trains moving down multiple tracks, and the legal experts I talk to say, absent congressional intervention, and the NCAA is trying to get a codification that, athletes are not university employees, but absent that, the train's going to reach its destination, and we're going to have at least some athletes deemed employees of their universities. And lawmakers today kept trying to pin down UCLA quarterback Chase Griffin, who was a refreshing presence as the first Power 5 football player at one of these hearings, if he wants to be an employee. And he was really sharp and great. And he just said, well, that's not my decision. That's the National Labor Relations Board's decision. And, you know, so he was really, really acute, really smart on that topic. And look, from people I talked to, how would it affect college sports? You know, I don't think it would not be a net positive for athletes. I think it would be a net negative for athletes. It's a mixed bag at best. It
Mhm.
introduces collective bargaining. Introduces revenue sharing, but much more than that, you could hire or fire, you could fire athletes. And there's an untold number of questions and issues and unknown consequences right now. I think the sweet spot in a new model is a true revenue sharing model where athletes receive a portion of the broadcast revenue pie. You know, the college football playoff is going to triple in size and bring in, according to the Knight Commission, an average of $1.4 billion in new revenue each year. Where's that going to go? Right now, it's not going to the athletes on the field. So there's going to be, I think, amplified calls for that to trickle down into the pockets of athletes. I think that's the sweet spot. I've not met anybody who wants an employee model, but everybody's watching with some trepidation what will occur in those National Labor Relations Board cases. And look, let's be clear, it's going to take years to play out, but that could radically reimagine the college sports landscape as we know it.
Eric,
you.
you make a
Yeah.
great point, because so much of the conversation continues to hinge on that $30,000 figure that was thrown out. But as we know, that once the conferences are able to decide what the conference schedule will be, those conferences could come back and say, well, we voted $10,000. Well, that dramatically changes the impact and effect that and support that students will get, particularly when, with graduate assistants, going back to them as an example, their price range annually for them ranges from a low of $12,000 to a high of $85,000, and the medium is $32,000 right now. And schools are absorbing that cost. But I think when the schools decide to run the analytics to decide what that number will be, I don't believe it will be $30,000.
Right. And at the heart of the employee question is
Yeah.
this issue of control and how
Right.
much control schools exercise over their athletes. And Chase Griffin, the UCLA quarterback, said today, based on the time we invest, the effort we give, our schedules beyond the practice time, we are employees right now. And I think that's powerful. And that's part of what is being weighed by the NLRB, you know, in the coming months.
We had a student that wrote a comment to us when we were, I was on a committee where we were discussing NIL in the inception, when NIL was purely about students can't work at all and students wanted to obtain a job because they had tuition, but they didn't have things to subsist and survive on during the day after class. And the student says, I have a question. Can the coach make me sign autographs after the game? Is that part of my responsibility as a student, or is this part of the way that they're collecting fees and funds from fans? And this goes back into how are all these things, how are all of them going to be structured?
Yeah, Maddie, I want to come to you on the employment question, employees, and also maybe interject the question of unionization as well, because I suspect that that's the next question. If they become employees, then do they form a union? And I know you've been involved in working with players extensively. So what are your thoughts on that matter?
I think a critical issue moving forward is that athletes need to be able to organize in some way, shape, or form. They need to be able to independently advocate for themselves, and they've got to be part of this conversation. I mean, one of the other issues with all of this is that we're still all in a room talking about what's best for athletes, and it's not athletes with any power to kind of sway that conversation other than trying to influence individuals, right, by speaking on topics. I think, I think it's true. I think nobody knows what it's going to look like if athletes are deemed employees tomorrow. I think that it very well could result in athletes being in a much worse position, especially without many checks and balances in place. And, we're all employees here. There are a lot of protections in place for employees. It doesn't mean that employees don't experience abuse from employers and other issues similar to athletes. I think some of the pushback that I do hear about employment status with the hire fire, I mean, I would argue that coaches hire and fire athletes now. They force athletes out of schools. They take away scholarships. They're doing it with the collectives too. Right now, coaches are directing where the funds are going, and they're reaching out to collective directors, and in some cases saying, oh yeah, we don't want to pay them anymore. Stop, cancel their contract. So those things are going on so to some degree, exactly what would take place if athletes were employees is taking place now. We just call it something slightly different. But I think, I do think there's a lot of hesitation to go fully down that route. I think that there is a little bit of a sweet spot right now for athletes. But if athletes are deemed employees tomorrow, none of us are in control of that. And I do think there need to be systems in place, and there needs to be some anticipation that that might be the case and what that might look like. And my particular concern is, how do we protect athletes in that? And I think that they need an independent voice is one of those ways, and they need people who can help them. So, I think that there are so many unanswered questions in all of that. Will athletes be paid minimum wage? Will they get some kind of stipend? What will that actually look like? We just don't know. So I think for anyone to say that this will absolutely be the best path for athletes, I don't think anybody can say that. So.
Thank you, Maddie. Oliver, can I come to you next? There's a question from the audience from Patty, Rob Keller, similar issue here in terms of employment. And Patty writes, if student athletes get paid, should they still get scholarships? Will scholarships be a part of the benefits of employment? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
That's, I suppose, like everything with an employer or employee relationship, that's to be negotiated. It's certainly a fringe benefit, much like healthcare or whatever the other 401k contribution that an employer would make, et cetera. That's all left to the marketplace in a sense, I would think. We're clearly moving away from the notion that a scholarship is enough for a student athlete to compete, go to school, graduate, ideally, 4 or 5, whatever number of years you're on campus. So that's all part of the discussion about employment. And keep in mind, there could be collective bargaining. To Maddie's point about the athletes needing a voice, I think she's 100% correct. There could be collective bargaining without necessarily a union. That's the case with the Screen Actors Guild. We just witnessed a long strike of the Screen Actors Guild out in California, out in LA, and they're all independent, mostly independent contractors for various studios and showrunners and what have you. But they collectively bargain with the various studios to achieve their goals. So having a collective voice doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you need to have unionization and employer-employee status.
And if I may stay with you for this next question, which I think is pertinent, what about students' NILs? Do you think universities can buy their NILs or should buy their NILs? And as we discussed a couple of days ago, do you think it should be predicated on their good standing as a student? I mean, how does that relationship? How do you reconcile that relationship in your mind?
Well, that's a very good question. If students are deemed employees and there's an employer-employee relationship, then the massive corpus of labor law in this country will come into play. And I think we'd all agree that that's very difficult to know how that would all play out. Look at the National Football League or the NBA or any of the professional leagues. The players are employees. The players are not allowed to use the marks of their teams. If I play for the Houston Texans, I can't use the Houston Texans mark unless it's part of a sponsorship deal that the Texans have, and I'm the player that's representing them. So, there's lots of fine tuning and nuance that needs to happen. But very well, the whole NIL world could very much look like what you see professional athletes. And there are plenty of guys and gals on TV hawking various products, et cetera. We all watched the Super Bowl, I'm sure, a year or two ago when cryptocurrency was the big thing, and everybody was telling everybody to go out and buy cryptocurrency. Now those folks are getting sued. So there's a whole package of of labor law that will apply. And let's be very candid with each other. You know, the massive corpus of labor law in this country is enormous. So, you know, to add 500 employees at University X, Y, or Z is a very serious endeavor, both for the university and for, you know, all those students who now all of a sudden have to, you know, abide by rules that they may or may not, you know, be really supporting.
Thank you so much. So I guess what you're saying is you can't wear your Houston Oilers helmet around, those great helmets from way back when. That's a shame, because those are some of the best helmets that ever were.
Well, it's a great logo. Thank you. The Tennessee Titans are wearing that logo and sort of refreshing it, if you will. But the point is that's not my, as a former Oiler, that's not my logo to monetize, quite honestly. And I'm sure if I tried to, I'd get a nasty cease and desist letter.
Right.
Well,
So-
that's actually one of the, sorry, I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say, one of the fascinating things in the whole NIL discussion is the fact that we ignore that these areas of the law, we function in other areas, right? Like, this is not a novel concept, right? Of publicity and the ability to use another person or entity's marks. I found it very fascinating that it was specified in so many different state pieces of legislation that they they had to explicitly state you couldn't use the marks of a university. Well, no, you couldn't. They could sue you regardless. You didn't have to explicitly lay that out. So
at the moment a university said to one of its students, no, I'm sorry, Maddie, you can't use the Duke mark, right? You would get upset and they would lose recruits because you know, most student athletes are identified by the school that, you know, that they're attending or playing for.
right. Well, and that's where I felt like it was short-sighted, and there should have been more thought given to allowing schools to work with their athletes and take advantage of making bigger deals with their athletes, allowing them to use their marks, using their athletes' name, image, and likeness. And I think we are starting to move in that direction, and brands have gotten very smart with that. But those were all areas of NIL in particular where we just acted like this has never existed before, and no one has ever thought through these issues in any other context.
Right. And it's occurred to me that, you know, the NIL from third parties paying for athletes' NILs seemed like a great idea at first. And now maybe some universities are starting to say, hey, wait, we want to take the power back. Right. So, you know, I want to come back to this question of whether the Power Four is being invited to break away. And I want to go to Eric for this question, if you don't mind. When it comes to potentially breaking away from the NCAA, what do you think is that breaking point for the NCAA, for the Power Four, I should say?
And that's exactly how I was going to frame this, Aaron, when you were leading up to the question. What is the breaking point? It's the mounting legal threats that are out there, the growing number of lawsuits that are coming fast and furious now. You just have to think a guy like Greg Sankey, Tony Petitti, they're sitting back. Okay, what's the breaking point? And I don't know the answer, but there has to be one because they've got to be tired of this. And absent congressional intervention or collective bargaining, where the athletes can collectively bargain for their rights and benefits, you're going to continue to see lawsuit after lawsuit, antitrust lawsuits being filed. So where does that end? Now, I don't think the NCAA does not want a breakaway. And I want to echo a point that Oliver made, which I think is completely underreported and not talked about enough now. If there is a breakaway and the Power Four, you know, move outside the umbrella of the NCAA to craft their own policies, govern themselves, set their own rules, they're also going to do something else. They're going to take the basketball away and say, we're going to stage our own very lucrative postseason championship tournament. And there's going to be a number of potential partners out there willing to spend a lot of money on that. We've already seen Fox move to create a tournament with power conference teams to try to bury the NIT. And that got a lot of people's attention in the NCAA, no question. That's the golden goose for the NCAA, March Madness. And it delivers some $1 billion per year. And without that, we saw what happened in 2020 when they had to cancel the NCAA tournament for COVID. And I think it cost them about $600 million in a loss. And And that was really devastating. And you know, a high ranking source told me we cannot have that happen again. We have to stage the NCAA tournament. So that I think is going to be an issue that comes into play really regardless of whether there is a breakaway or not, because the deal with CBS and Warner Brothers Discovery ends in 2032. And at that point, you know, if you're not placating the power conferences and those teams, they could say, hey, we don't want the little guy in this. We can just stage our own tournament and get more money that way. You know, however, I believe that what makes the secret sauce for March Madness is having the little guy in there, the mid-major, the upsets. And when you tinker with that, you really risk damaging a true American, you know, treasure. So the future of the NCAA tournament will come into play in all of this, even though right now it looks like everything is driven by football.
Excellent
Right.
point, because in the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference, we are known for being Goliath slayers in the
That's
tournament, particularly in the rounds, and we love that. But at the same time, we want more than one representative in the tournament, because our conference, you're only going to get one unit. You're only going to get one team in. And then when we look at, you know, certain other conferences, you know, the top 7 teams get in the tournament, and, you know, they're enriched by way of the rules. And so now you break away and say, let's keep all of our money in one pot. And we're not even going to play the small schools because they will impact our power ranking. So it really matters that we vet the entire process and keep the little guy in and keep those opportunities for Cinderella stories, because that's when the viewership goes up and hits its peaks.
So what about education, though? If these, I mean, we know that, you know, Pac-12, 10 of the Pac-12 have left. And so we know that these schools are willing to break away, right? When money's on the line. And so we wouldn't be surprised if the Power Four broke away, right? But
Right.
What happens to education at that point? That's a question for anybody who's willing to answer.
Well, I say in academics and athletics all the time that as a middle to low resource institution, and as an HBCU, we are educating and providing access to skills and abilities for our student athletes beyond professional sports. It includes it, but is not the priority. And we also are doing so by placing folks into, you know, the technical skills, the sciences, and the professional degree areas as well. So it matters to us that all things are tied to undergirding a student's ability to get gainful employment. We had a discussion when I was on the committee of academics, and I raised the issue. I said, you know, we have a pro departure that allows us to maintain credits associated with the APR when an athlete leaves and goes and signs a contract for a professional sports team. They may not ultimately make the team, but they signed a contract. I said, well, I have construction management engineering. I have architecture drafting. I have electronics majors who have left school to join companies as civil engineers and as project managers. They didn't get a pro departure. And the principal reason they were in school to those very trades and disciplines. So we really have to assess, are we penalizing students who leave for another reason and other than academics?
Yeah, as a follow-up to this question, and maybe this is a question for Maddie or Oliver, I'm not sure, but this is from the audience. This is Lawrence Cohen writing, could you incorporate education requirements into a CBA? So assuming there was collective bargaining and athletes were able to secure, you know, unionization in that CBA, could there be requirements that athletes, in order to play for universities, are required to be students?
I think the answer is absolutely. The one pillar that college athletics, you know, sort of leans on right now is academics. It's not amateurism, that's dead and gone. It's about academics. So clearly, whether there's a collectively bargained section regarding the obligation of the student to attend class and APR and all the things that that exist. That's the only thing that's really tying that student to to the institution and by definition to the football, basketball, soccer, whatever field hockey club. So yeah, and that's something that students need to be aware of. There could be clauses in the CBA that say if you miss class twice or 3 times without an excuse, then you're fired, right? That's a violation of your employment contract, and the CBA, boom, act. So all of that needs to get shaped, and we can talk about it and speculate, but there's so many details that may have an effect on whether this is really what college athletics should become, what student athletes really want or don't want at the end of the day. It's a very difficult question to answer without really getting a lot of really going deep into the details.
Right. And I mean, the point too of the CBA is it's bargained for. So you would have athlete input that they're willing to give something up to get something, and you have a negotiation. I also think, to touch on the educational side of things, I think it's time to rethink education, not just for athletes, but from a larger perspective. I think there's a greater question about how valuable higher education is for certain students, not just athletes. I think that there's tremendous educational value in being an athlete and the things that you learn, and especially in the NIL era, the things that athletes are exposed to. And I think it's time to rethink certain curriculum and think through how can an athlete get credit for certain things. I mean, one example I like to point out is I when I was in school, I still had to get a physical education credit, even though I was a varsity athlete. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I think that there's so many things that you can call education. We need to be more creative in how we sort of structure something to move athletes in a direction that they are interested in, and be focused on connecting them with people that can kind of help them with their careers. Again, I think NIL has really opened that up. I thought Chase Griffin really articulated that very well during the congressional hearing. I think there have been a number of athletes that are currently taking advantage of NIL opportunities who are making business contacts and establishing themselves in ways that the athletes of the past couldn't do. So I think that we need to think through, what are we calling education, and what are we criticizing about an athlete's trajectory versus a regular student who's in the classroom more, who's on campus more? How can we really sort of structure an education around an athlete if this is the world that we're moving towards? If, athletes are going to be traveling across the country to be participants in certain conferences, how do we make sure that they're really benefiting from the educational side of their universities? So I think it's really reconceptualizing what we think of when we think of education.
Maddie, let me follow up with you there with a question from Sanford Thatcher. The question is, do varsity athletes learn more from being an athlete than club athletes? Club athletes learn how to balance academics and athletics, which is why many choose to be club athletes in the first place.
I would say that varsity athlete is a greater commitment. I mean, ultimately, if you're a club athlete, you can choose not to go to practice. I had friends who played on club teams. I thought sometimes that sounded a lot more appealing, because if it was cold outside and it was raining sideways, they just could decide to stay home and do their homework and not go to practice. I think it's still a great experience, just like being involved in any organization on campus is, if it's something that you're interested in, and there are opportunities that they get to take advantage of. And I mean, when I talk to athletes who are considering playing in college, even, I talk a lot about the club sport experience and whether varsity is really even something that they want because of the trade-offs. Because it is a tremendous sacrifice, and it will continue to be. And as much as there are so many benefits, and I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had, there are a lot of things that you have to give up. There are a lot of things I couldn't take advantage of as a student and a nerd, and and the things that you really kind of want to do while you're in school. So I think it's a choice you have to make, but I think the commitment is tremendous in comparison to a club sport athlete.
But in the viewpoint, Aaron, whether or not you're using athletics to provide the financial support to obtain skills and abilities in college, or you're using college to gain a professional contract as an athlete, And in my environment, the former is most true, that we are investing in students to become the next scientist, the next engineer, the next construction worker, the next nurse, and they're using sports as a vehicle to pay for that. And I think that also undergirds the passion that many of the institutions who are not a part of those 59 institutions above $100 million that they employ, that they really push. You'll leave with a quality education, but you'll also have an opportunity to participate in Division I sports as well.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. I'm curious if Eric, would you like to take a question from the audience? This is from Alan Konopka, saying the NLRB decision will focus on team control over athlete time, schedule, speech, etc. Is anyone thinking about what level of reduced control would keep athletes as non-employees? For example, they could skip practice to study for exams.
It's interesting. Yeah, I listened to the entire hearing, 4-day hearing in the Dartmouth case. They went into meticulous detail about what are the repercussions if you skip practice? What are the repercussions if you skip class? What about would you skip a game? What are the repercussions there? And if my memory serves me right, the athlete, say you could skip class to go to a game, but he's not going to skip class to go to a practice. It's fuzzy about what line exists that would be that threshold of control that would put the athletes in the employee category. And that's why the cases are so fascinating. A regional director could rule any day on that Dartmouth case. Now there's going to be appeals. These are going to be ongoing. But in the USC case with the Pac-12 and the NCAA, two points I want to make. I mean, one, they're really honing in on the student athlete handbook and the media policy, and whether athletes have to abide by certain rules to be interviewed by media members, or whether it's their discretion and they could accept any interview they'd like. And it's from covering college sports 25 years, they're controlled by the coaches and the team. So if the coaches don't want them to speak after a game, he's going to close the locker room. We've seen it done time and time again. That's the coach's decision. The athlete can't overrule the coach in that manner. Now USC in the case said, hey, it's only guidelines. The athletes have full freedom and it's part of their educational experience. And we encourage them to take part in interviews with the media. So a couple of days after that, we did this big project where we interviewed 50 college leaders on big picture issues. I emailed USC specifically and asked for any athlete in any sport to answer these two questions, big picture questions, regarding NIL and the future of college sports. No response. So, I don't know if they were asked. But the second part is the key part of that NLRB case with USC, the Pac-12, and the NCAA. They're being charged with being joint employers. And the fact that the Pac-12 and the NCAA is also in there, if a ruling is made that those basketball and football players, men's and women's basketball, are employees at USC, the fact that the Pac-12 and NCAA are charged with being joint employers, it could open this up to public schools as well, and then it gets a lot more complicated. So there's a lot on the line with that case.
Yeah, indeed, and it relates to another question that Alan asked this time for Oliver. This is a quote from a book from 20 years ago by the University of Michigan president James Duderstadt, and the quote is: "At many universities, graduate student teaching assistants not only are recognized legally as employees, but allowed to form unions for collective bargaining. It is ironic that those students compensated for academic activities are considered employees, while those students compensated for performing in highly profitable athletic businesses are not," close quote. And Alan would like you, Oliver, to explain why he's wrong.
Well, listen, Michigan is riding high. Even presidents that served 20 years ago are probably happy with the national championship. I mean, there's a long history, and it's very often state by state of grad students and teaching assistants, who've unionized. Some states prohibit their students and at their state universities from being employees unionized, and other states don't. It's, it's the federal system we have, right? The states are laboratories of democracy. The question really boils down to the issue of whether big time college athletics, is it really still just an extracurricular activity where you wake up in the morning as a football player in 1978, and I'm giving my background, and you have more or less the morning free to take all your classes. You're not expected to, check in to the football office until 2:00, watch a little film, get your ankles taped, go out and practice, come back, have dinner, and you have your evening free, right? Is it really just an extracurricular activity, or has the system created such a rigid sort of, framework for big time college athletics, at least in the revenue sports, because the question of control, as we've all heard, is a critical one for the NLRB, and the answer is going to be yes. These kids are controlled from 7 a.m. in the morning until probably 8 or 9 in the evening. That's just, look at their schedule. They put it on the their little screens in the facilities. So that case, I think, will be lost, and the question is, are people thinking about what the alternative may be? To Maddie's point, is there an alternative, and are serious people giving really serious and deep thought to what those alternatives could be? I'll say one other thing that to me is a little bit of a cautionary tale. For years, the NCAA said, we're so popular, our football or basketball or whatever sport, we're popular because people are rooting for the name on the front of the jersey, right? University XYZ. And they thought, these people, that NIL would absolutely be a dagger in the popularity of college athletics. Just the opposite has happened. TV ratings are through the roof. Attendance is up. Caitlin Clark has become a celebrity. Nobody would have ever expected a women's basketball player from Iowa to become a celebrity. She's nationally known. She's earning a lot of money. TV ratings, as I mentioned, are through the roof. So I think we have to be careful to just assume that we would kill the golden goose if there was collective bargaining with student athletes. Maybe people will, just like they support the NFL or the NBA or other professional sports, they'll accept collective bargaining to equally powerful groups, labor and management negotiating. And I don't know if that would kill the golden goose at all. In fact, it may, just like we've seen NIL, it may actually sort of kickstart even more or accelerate more interest in our games.
You might bring more attention. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Maddie.
I was going to say the other component of that is that, it was alluded to in the Alston opinion that if suddenly athletes were able to collectively bargain, this, case wouldn't apply anymore. The NCAA could institute a lot of rules that also might be very popular to fans as a result of the collective bargaining process, by virtue of the fact that athletes agree to be bound by certain rules in exchange for something else that they desire. And I think through that process, you really would get a better sense of what athletes truly care about. And I think that sometimes we get lost in the minutia of all these issues that we as practitioners or people who are not current athletes think is important. But when it comes down to it, what an athlete really needs, even in this generation of social media and all these other pressures that they're dealing with, what they really need may be very different than what we think they need and what they're willing to, give up to get it.
Speaking of that point, Maddie, and I was going to save this for the end, but we're coming towards the end anyway. What do you think should be done to give athletes a greater voice in this discussion?
And I think there is a multifaceted approach that needs to happen. I think it does start with actually educating athletes. I guess to take it back a step, the difficulty in representing athletes as a current athlete is that a lot of athletes don't understand the rules and how they apply to them until they're affected negatively by them. And it's very difficult to get certain athletes to engage and be very involved in the process enough to even give their input on what they think certain rules should be. So there is an overall need to educate first. And then I think you actually need representation by sport. I think that, one of the issues with SAC as well was you're trying to represent all athletes in all sports, and that's virtually impossible. There are different needs in every sport. There's different cultures. And so athletes in various sports need to be able to speak for themselves, and I think get very sport specific rules and deals that way. So I think there are a lot of things that need to be done, I think, to give voice to athletes, but it does start with giving them some sort of independent organization where they have advisors that they can trust, that are not the NCAA, that are not ultimately people embedded within the institutions, that they can feel comfortable speaking with and getting advice and really understanding the issues in a more comprehensive way. The other issue that you deal with, obviously, with college athletes is that they're there for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and then they're gone. And so getting the opinion of college athletes, it's kind of a moving target at times. So, and we're very new into the NIL era, even though it's been now a couple of years, but I think that there are a number of issues, and I think that's why you need also former athletes involved and people who really understand the issues and have the perspective to give solid advice to even have some of these negotiations.
Thank you. And there's another question here from the audience. I think this might be best suited to Eric and Dr. Banks, but I certainly will open the floor to anybody. This is from Scott Benson, who writes, rather than looking at conferences leaving the NCAA, why not deal with the elephant in the room and have the NCAA eliminate FBS football from the list of sports that are sponsored and supported? Eric, in your reporting, have you come across this idea, or is this something that you think has legs?
Not especially. Obviously the CFP controls football in the postseason. I want to bring in a point. When Maddie was talking about student athlete voice and involvement, for me, it is unbelievable, actually unbelievable, that they managed to triple the size of the college football playoff and not ask any athlete what they thought about it, since, they're the ones on the field playing the additional games and being at risk for injury. We all remember when the NFL went from 16 to 17 games, they certainly brought the players in, and it was a big discussion point. That has to change. We have to get student athlete involvement. They have to have a seat at the table. They were not brought in either for realignment decisions, and that wasn't going to change what was happening, but there was no reporting that I saw that, some of the Pac, like Washington or Oregon, went to their field hockey players or softball and said, well, how do you feel about making midweek trips to, central New Jersey to play Rutgers? This was all football driven. It was done very quickly. So I know this doesn't answer that specific question, but I think student athlete voice and involvement at the seat at the table is going to be a critical issue, certainly that I cover, and just being raised throughout the industry as we move toward a revenue sharing model. Because the other point I want to make, and we talked about this on the phone, the public sentiment regarding revenue sharing has changed dramatically from what I've seen. I would say in the last 8 months. Early last summer, I'd ask ADs, conference commissioners, and the most progressive, forward-thinking ones. Joe Castiglione in Oklahoma was one of them, who would say it's time to at least explore. Let's at least explore what a revenue sharing model would look like. Nobody would really go further than that, and most would say it's premature. Now it's completely different. Now a growing number say it's time not just to explore it, but it's time for athletes to get a share of the revenue. Joe Castiglione, Jim Harbaugh, many other prominent ones. And in fact, it's very difficult to find an athletic director or commissioner or leading stakeholder who will go on the record and say, no, athletes don't deserve a share of the revenue. So we're moving in that direction, and it's just a matter of how we get there.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Eric, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I'm curious. There's another question from the audience from Michael Kavanaugh. This says, but 90 to 95% of programs lose money. The University of Houston loses almost $50 million a year. What percentage of that can athletes bargain for? Anybody want to take that one?
Well,
It starts with a false premise.
yeah, it's a great point, but and I think the bigger picture though is that the finances across the board are completely different, and universities that are in the Ivy League don't provide athletic scholarships, but focus on financial aid, and you have other schools that are offering scholarships, and some schools have 30 plus sports that are NCAA recognized sports. Others have, a 16, the minimum. So, there's a completely unequal playing field right now when it comes to overall budgets. But the point also to be taken from that clever question is there are a whole bunch of schools, including those schools in the so-called, Power Four, that are not running, profitable athletic departments. They're being subsidized by the institution in some cases, in a very significant way, and that's a point that has to be acknowledged as well.
Absolutely, and in many cases with subsidies to students who are not athletes. And sometimes they don't know, those students don't actually know that they're paying for athletics, even if they don't go to the games, they don't care about athletics at all. I want to get to the transfer portal, because I know that that's something that I've spoken with several of the panelists about before. Maybe I'll start with Eric again. What are you hearing about what people are saying about the transfer portal in your reporting, and how that's changed things as well? Because that was a development that took place around the same time that NIL became more of a nationwide thing. So what have you found in your reporting?
Are you talking about the coaching carousel that we've just seen with the coaches jumping around?
That's
It goes both ways,
yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's nuts. It's dizzying. It's hard to follow. It has changed college football so dramatically. It's hard to even, express it. We're not going back. We're not putting the toothpaste back in a tube. But one thing I think needs to happen, you got to change the window. You got to have that window after the CFP games, or else it's like like staging free agency during the NFL playoffs or something like that. And it's just illogical. So from a timing perspective, it does not work right now. And that I think needs to be fixed. And hopefully they are in the process of doing that in the coming years. But in terms of, players transferring and not having to sit out a year, we're not going back. And I'm talking about multiple transfers as well. It's going to be like that. And has NIL ruined the popularity of college football? No, it has not, as Oliver mentioned. Has the transfer portal ruined the popularity? No, it has not. In fact, Deion Sanders, who camped out in the portal all last winter, was Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year. And I'd go a step forward saying both NIL and the portal, both together, are two of the reasons why college football was so popular this year, setting record viewership numbers, the most watched season across all networks in college football history. Teams can rebuild very quickly, and there's incredible interest on who's going where. So that's going to continue. I say just change the window, and then that's a significant step forward.
Dr. Banks, I'm sorry, Oliver. I just want to follow up with Dr. Banks about that, because we spoke about this recently. Dr. Banks, what about a limited resource institutions? And I know we spoke about how sometimes it can feel like a stepping stone for some of these athletes to come to your university and then go somewhere else, where maybe through the transfer portal they can find a better deal. What are you seeing at Norfolk State?
A favorite topic is the portal giveth and the portal taketh away. So as a limited resource institution, there are times where we have been able to attract students who want to change institutions for a variety of reasons, whether it was identification of mental health challenges or episodes that they dealt with, or homesickness, or in some times a negative relationship with their coaching staff and environment. And in other times, particularly with international students, sometimes they have just changed because the culture was just too different for them. But we also have experience where at our institution and at our levels, you can rest assured when our MEAC Player of the Year, when our top scorers, top rebounders in basketball in particular, have a successful year and beginnings of their career, they're being tapped, they're being visited, they're being recruited away to majority institutions who say, well, you took care of that first year of competition and those entry-level classes that you took for a major. We now want you to transfer here because we see that you would be great over here. We missed you in the recruiting process, but we saw you at that roundup and we saw you at that holiday tournament. And I think you should join us because we're going to provide you an NIL.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. Mr. Luck, I apologize for cutting off there. You had something to say.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say there's going to be at some point a gut check regarding the transfer portal. I agree with Eric, we're not going back, but once enough data is collected to determine whether multiple transfers either slows down a student from graduating or has the effect of a student not graduating at all, that hasn't yet. I guess that data hasn't yet been collected. We've been years? I guess like 3 years now into the portal. But that's something where I think there's going to be a little bit of a gut check about the importance of academics and the importance of academic progress towards a degree, because ultimately, this is an enterprise that we've been talking about for the last hour and plus. It's an enterprise lodged within higher education. And if we completely ignore the academic element, that doesn't seem to me to be the right thing either. Despite all the popularity and growth of the popularity of football, men's basketball, women's basketball, a lot of the other sports as well.
I think the flip side of the education aspect of it is that, if an athlete is having if they're being more successful on the field, if they're a part of a better team culture, they're going to perform better in the classroom. And I think we sometimes ignore that issue a little bit and forget how many athletes actually were very much abused by the system before the transfer, really not even before the transfer portal, but before, athletes were able to be eligible immediately and before conferences got rid of their interconference rules that required an athlete to sit out a year. So there were many ways that athletes were being held in bad situations, whether it was they were struggling with mental health, whether they had a bad coach, whether they had a negative team environment, whether they were just struggling academically and it just wasn't a good fit, or they decided to major in something else, or they thought they could be happier somewhere else. We don't question as much why a coach leaves, but every time an athlete does, there's this whole debate about whether this is something we should allow, when in reality, when a coach leaves, they actually leave hundreds of athletes in the lurch on a football team, and all of the people that they recruited and all, and so it has a much greater impact on the athletes when the coach leaves versus when individual athletes leave. And I am always hesitant to put more restrictions or shorten any windows during which an athlete can leave for that reason, because I've spoken to so many athletes who are in terrible situations who really just don't know what to do because their athletic career is in jeopardy at that point.
And may I add, at our initial NIL discussions and transfer discussions in particular, one of the common themes that was submitted to us as discussions from student athletes was that, everything here was kind of great. I can't say I have a negative thing to say about my institution, but because of the position that I held in the number 2, 3, or 4 position on my team, I only got to play 3, 4, 5 games the last 2 to 6 minutes, but that burnt my entire year. And I want to go somewhere where I can get more time, not because I'm not a capable player, but because I'm in a rotation and I just cannot get the playing time. Coach is not an issue of coach liking or disliking me. And so students were losing a full year, 2 years of eligibility purely because they were on a deep roster.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Didn't like them for no good reason, and they were actually very talented athletes.
Yeah.
We're coming up on the end here, and so I want to ask one final question for everybody. We'll start with Maddie and go to Eric, and then Oliver, and then Dr. Banks in that order. But will this proposal by Charlie Baker lead to universities one day cementing an employer and employee system with athletes? What do you think?
Well, I don't think it's going to have anything to do with Charlie Baker's proposal. It's going to be a decision by, lawmakers, by a court, by whomever. So I think it will get schools thinking in that direction. I just don't think that's not going to in and of itself create that environment. I think that if anything, schools are going to try and create an alternative model that is not employee-employer.
Eric, what about you?
What I think this proposal will do, I think they're going to fast track the NIL element and get that in there. It's trying to get the attention of Congress to try to get the antitrust protection and codify that athletes are not employees. In the short term, I think they're going to strike out on that. So what I'm watching is a potential settlement in the House case over the next 12 months. Right now, you got about $4.2 billion at stake. The defendants are the NCAA and Power 5 conferences. However, what Charlie Baker said today was that all college sports could absorb the damages bill for this. And that was the first time I heard that. So this is an issue that everybody in college sports needs to pay attention to. And if they could reach a settlement, could they work it in a way that they could also get the congressional intervention that they're desperately seeking to provide the antitrust protection and thwart, further antitrust lawsuits? That's what I'm watching.
Thank you, Eric. What about you, Oliver?
I think Charlie Baker is trying to really thread the needle. It's very difficult. And I don't think it necessarily by itself, to Maddie's point, will lead to the employer-employee status. But I think he's trying to thread the needle, placate a number of different people, get Congress involved at some level. It's questionable whether all of that is going to work into a manageable system or not. I'm hesitant to give any kind of a prediction because it's a very complex issue.
Thank you. What about you, Dr. Banks?
I think it's a very, very dynamic situation. Totally agree with Maddie. But I will say, as long as this conversation hinges on the principal single sport of football, no. The issue will become when you can see profitability across the additional sports, including the Olympic sports, and then you have the collective power of numbers for student athletes across the country.
Thank you so much. Anybody with a final word? Any topic that they want to say one more thing about?
I guess to that point of the other sports, I think NIL has created an opportunity for athletes to market themselves in ways that the schools have not. And I think over time, as it's given more time, you are going to see more sports game popularity as fans can engage directly with athletes in ways that schools did not do for any other sports other than football and basketball. And much in the same way that you saw the NBA rise from not being very profitable when it started to now, you can see the same thing in other sports. But the NCAA schools were very short-sighted for a very long time, thinking that football and basketball were their bread and butter and not even trying to develop their other sports and market them.
I would say, in terms of final comments, I have two. One is a passion of mine to say, I hope the association keeps on the front burner the unit for women's basketball and to provide that unit of financial support for the institutions to elevate the program, elevate the exposure. And the second is to visit the re-expansion of the Accelerating Academic Support Grant, which was a program that the NCAA developed for moderate to low income resource institutions to assist in providing academic support for the programs. And the funds were multi-year grants up to $900,000, but it required 75, 50, and 25% matching from the institutions. But it had positive results that provided an increased number of graduation rates and retention rates amongst the institutions that were in those cohorts. And we have the data that shows the improvements. And it's time for us to look at how we spend the new money from the contract to reestablish those types of grant programs that schools participated in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banks. And thank you all for being panelists. It has been a very eye-opening discussion, and I really appreciate it. Thank you to the listeners as well. We really appreciate you being here. We will have another Drake Group webinar on critical issues in college sports on February 15th. Please join us for that and look out for announcements about that via email and social media. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.